Hello, friends, and welcome back to another long, winding tale from history. If you've clicked on this, you're probably looking for one of two things. Either you're here for history, real, messy, often a little stranger than legend, or, and perhaps more likely, you're here because you want something calm and rambling to let your brain unwind. In either case, you're in the right place. Tonight or morning, or whatever odd liminal time you stumbled upon this, we'll be wandering through four stories. For bits of the past that people in both America and Britain tend to enjoy, either because they are foundational myths or delicious mysteries, or disasters retold so many times they become oddly soothing. The stories are The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, the American Revolution's most famous horse-powered delivery service. The Lost Colony of Roanoke, which is either a tragedy, a mystery, or an early example of poor project management. The Great Fire of London, in which an entire city accidentally reinvented urban planning by burning itself down. And finally, the Lewis and Clark Expedition, which is what happens when you hand two men a notebook, a canoe, and several thousand miles of wilderness. Now, don't worry, this is not a quiz. You don't need to memorize dates. In fact, I would actively encourage you not to. The goal here is to let your mind wander, to enjoy the rhythm of the story. And if you find your eyelids getting heavy, well, I'll take that as a compliment. So settle in, get comfortable, maybe with a blanket, maybe with a faint glow of your phone screen illuminating your ceiling as you give in to sleep. And let's begin. Part 1, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, 1775. It was April 1775. The American colonies were restless. Taxes, tea, stamps, all the usual irritants when an empire decides you're more useful as a cash register than as actual people. The British authorities, or regulars as they were called, and no, not redcoats, not yet, that nickname would come later, had decided to march out from Boston to seize weapons hidden in the nearby town of Concord. The colonists, naturally, weren't thrilled about this. If someone's about to confiscate your stockpile of guns and ammunition, it usually doesn't bode well for your future. So they set up a system, a sort of 18th century alarm network, before Twitter, before WhatsApp groups. Lanterns in a church steeple, one if by land, two if by sea. Enter Paul Revere. He wasn't the only rider that night, but his name is the one that stuck, largely thanks to a 19th century poem that sacrificed accuracy for rhyme. Revere mounted his horse and galloped through the Massachusetts countryside, rousing sleepy farmers and innkeepers with the news. The British are coming. Now, there's a good chance he didn't actually shout, "The British are coming," because that would have been redundant. Everyone in Massachusetts in 1775 was aware of the British. They were literally occupying Boston. More likely, he said something practical like, "The regulars are out," which is admittedly less poetic, but also less likely to get you mocked by your neighbors. The ride itself was less Hollywood and more endurance test. Picture Revere, hunched over in a chill spring night, hooves pounding, passing through silent villages where dogs barked and shutters opened just enough for someone to mutter, "Oh, it's Revere again, shouting about soldiers." Still, it worked. The militia mustered. Shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. And a revolution, a rather successful one from the American perspective, was underway. And the best part? Paul Revere actually got caught. Yes, despite all the drama, British soldiers intercepted him. They confiscated his horse, left him on foot, and sent him home. It's a bit like being the star of a movie, only for someone else to finish the finale. But legends are built on half-truths, and so Revere galloped on, at least in the collective memory. Studio Microphone Part 2, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, 1775. So, we left Paul Revere mid-ride, probably cold, maybe a little hungry, definitely exhausted, and very aware that it just stepped into the kind of night that would haunt history books. It's important to note that Revere wasn't alone. He was part of a network, a group of riders who could be considered the original, slightly disorganized messenger app. There was William Dawes, another man on horseback, and Samuel Prescott, who joined the ride later, galloping along the winding roads with the efficiency of someone who knew every hollow, bend, and creek crossing in Massachusetts. One of the more charming things about Revere's ride is that it wasn't particularly glamorous. No, there were no dramatic sword fights under moonlight or cinematic leaps over fences. It was cold. It was wet. He probably cursed under his breath a few times. Imagine the mud sucking at the hooves of his horse, the occasional bark of a dog from a nearby farm. Every farmhouse he passed was a potential ally, but also a potential snore, and he had to be persuasive without alarming the entire neighborhood unnecessarily. The signals, by the way, were ingenious in their simplicity. Lanterns in the Old North Church in Boston communicated whether the British would arrive by land or sea. 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. It sounds simple, but you have to remember, this was 1775. There were no text messages. There were no phone calls. If you were asleep in your bed, you might wake up to a faint flicker in a steeple and immediately understand that the world outside your window was about to change. Revere's role, then, was not just a man on a horse. He was a living embodiment of a communication network. Every innkeeper, farmer, and sleepy townsperson he passed became part of this chain. It's slightly amusing, thinking about it now, that the American Revolution, one of the most significant political events in modern history, relied on the social awkwardness of rural Massachusetts. "Oh, sorry, can you saddle up my horse?" I guess I'm spreading the alarm. And then there's the human element. Revere was undoubtedly nervous. Not the kind of nerves you get when you're about to give a presentation or misplace your car keys. No, the nerves of a man who knew that capture could mean imprisonment or worse. Soldiers were patrolling. Roads weren't lit. Houses were silent, except for the occasional lantern. And in the stillness of the night, every rustle, every whisper of wind through the trees could seem like a threat. Now, Revere wasn't perfect. He made mistakes, just like anyone would under these conditions. He lost his horse at one point, intercepted by British patrols. There's a certain poetic justice to this. All the mythologizing of Revere as a lone rider, unstoppable and heroic, and yet in reality, he was delayed, blocked, and forced to improvise. History is often kinder to legend than to reality. But perhaps the most interesting part of this story, from a slightly sardonic perspective, is that it wasn't all about him. Revere gets a credit in popular culture, largely due to a poem written decades later. The kind of thing that immortalizes a man more than the actual events ever could. Dawes and Prescott, both just as brave, are largely footnotes. And Prescott, in fact, was the one who actually made it to Concord to warn the militia. But no, Revere's name has a staying power, probably because Paul Revere has a nice ring to it, whereas Samuel Prescott sounds like someone you'd meet at a library and politely nod at. The ride itself, while not as cinematic as we imagine, set the stage for the battles of Lexington and Concord. Shots were fired at dawn, the famous shot heard round the world, which is both dramatically overstated and completely accurate in its symbolism. Colonists exchanged fire with British troops, marking the official start of open conflict in the Revolutionary War. And it all began with a few lanterns in a steeple, a network of riders, and one man who was very determined not to be late. It's worth mentioning here, in this quiet hour, that the midnight ride has a rhythm that makes it almost hypnotic. You can imagine it. The gallop of hooves, the creak of saddles, the whisper of wind across fields, the low murmur of a few sleepless villagers. It's not high drama. It's a long, deliberate unfolding. And perhaps that's why it works so well for stories that help you drift off. The tension is there, yes, but it's steady, measured, and ultimately calming. And as Revere's night drew on, he passed farms where families huddled in blankets, watching the shadowy figure of a man on a horse. Perhaps a child asked if this was a dream, and the parent, in hushed tones, said, "No, that's history, my dear. Sleep now." Eventually, Revere returned to Boston, weary, cold, and with much less fanfare than the poem suggests. But the message had spread. The militia was mobilized. Revolution was underway. And for all the dramatics later immortalized in verse, the real story is quiet, patient, and oddly comforting. Perfect for long nights when the mind wanders as you lie in bed. So, if you've been following along, you now know Paul Revere was neither invincible nor omnipresent. He was a man, doing his part, caught in the middle of the night that history decided to remember more poetically than it actually occurred. And perhaps that's a lesson for all of us. Sometimes the most important acts are quiet, flawed, and human. And with that, we can begin to let our minds drift from colonial Massachusetts, from the clop of hooves and the faint flicker of lantern light, and gradually move toward another story, another mystery, quieter, but just as compelling in its own way. A story of disappearance, curiosity, and silent observation. The Lost Colony of Roanoke. Studio Microphone Part 3. The Lost Colony of Roanoke, 1587. So, we leave behind the clop of Paul Revere's horse, the flickering lanterns in colonial Massachusetts, and the beginnings of a revolution. We travel now, across the Atlantic, to a much warmer, but equally mysterious place. The year is 1587. The location is Roanoke Island, off the coast of what is now North Carolina. England, in its infinite curiosity and occasional overconfidence, decided that it would be a splendid idea to set up a colony in the New World. And why not? The land was vast. The resources seemed endless, and they had already perfected the art of underestimating the difficulties of starting a settlement thousands of miles from home. Into this scenario arrived a group of settlers, men, women, and children, led by a man named John White. White was not just any leader. He was a cartographer and artist, someone who liked to sketch things and perhaps had a mild obsession with detail. He documented the land, the people, and the strange flora in ways that, to us today, feel like a gentle prelude catastrophe. Because, as you may have guessed, things were about to go very wrong. White left the colony to return to England to gather supplies. This, in itself, is already a familiar pattern in history. A leader leaves, plans to return quickly, and then delays happen. The English were dealing with threats of war with Spain. Ships were busy. And suddenly, 3 years passed. 3 years in which nothing happened, or at least nothing that anyone documented. When White finally returned, he found the colony abandoned, houses dismantled, crops overgrown, not a soul in sight. The only clue? A single word carved into a post: Croton. Imagine the eeriness of that moment. You approach what you expect to be a bustling settlement and find silence instead. No one to greet you, no children playing, no dogs barking, just the wind whispering through abandoned huts. And the word Croton, mysterious, cryptic, tantalizing. Was a clue? A direction? A warning? History doesn't tell us. Not really. There's a certain quiet horror in that mystery. It's not the immediate terror of a battlefield or the chaos of a fire. No, this is subtler. It's the slow, creeping realization that people you expected to be there, people you counted on, have simply vanished. And yet, somehow, the story is calming in its rhythm because it is complete in its mystery. There is no gore. There is no shouting, just absence. Speculation has been the dessert of historians ever since. Did the settlers integrate with local Native American tribes? Did disease or starvation claim them quietly, leaving only their homes behind? Were they abducted, or did they wander off in search of better land? It's like a story that invites you to daydream, to imagine endless possibilities, while knowing you will never get a definitive answer. The Lost Colony also offers something oddly soothing to consider: the natural environment. White sketches remind us that the land was beautiful, untamed, full of strange plants, quiet rivers, and vast forests. You can almost feel the gentle breeze, smell the salt in the air, and hear the lapping of water against the shore. The silence of the colony itself becomes almost meditative, a lullaby of absence and curiosity. And there's a subtle humor in this, if you lean toward the sardonic. The English thought they could simply transplant a little slice of civilization into a place that had its own rules, its own rhythms. They arrived with plans, expectations, and lists of supplies, only to discover that the New World doesn't respond to checklists. It's a gentle reminder that sometimes nature doesn't negotiate. It just is. So, as we consider Roanoke, it's less about tragedy and more about pondering. The settlers disappeared, yes, but the story lingers in our imaginations like a half-remembered dream. And perhaps that's why it's so perfect for a sleepy night. It doesn't demand action. It doesn't require judgment. You can lie back, close your eyes, and imagine the wind through the palms, the distant cry of birds, the hush of empty homes. Roanoke, in its quiet mystery, also whispers a truth about history itself. Much of the past is unknowable. Much of it is speculation. And yet, we still tell the stories because there is comfort in narrative, even when the ending is missing. You can drift through possibilities like clouds across the sky, and eventually you might drift into sleep. As we leave Roanoke behind, with its vanished settlers and cryptic carvings, we move now to another story of disappearance. But this time, much closer to home for those of us in the British Isles. It's a tale of fire, reconstruction, and the slow, relentless march of urban life. The Great Fire of London, 1666. Part 4. The Great Fire of London, 1666. And so, we leave behind the silent forest of Roanoke, the carved word Sierra Leone, and the mystery that refuses to explain itself. We turn instead to something far less subtle, far less mysterious, and very, very hot. London, 1666. A city already heaving under its own contradictions. Narrow medieval streets. Buildings crammed close together, leaning over as if trying to gossip with their neighbors across the lane. Timber houses, thatched roofs, and all the architectural planning of a child stacking blocks. It was a city that had survived plague, political upheaval, and a monarchy that sometimes couldn't decide if it wanted to stay on the throne or lose its head. And then came the fire. It began, as so many great catastrophes do, in a place no one expected. A bakery. Thomas Farriner's Bakery on Pudding Lane, which, let's be honest, is possibly the most ironic name for the birthplace of fire. Pudding Lane suggests sweetness, comfort, maybe a sticky toffee pudding if you're lucky. Instead, what it produced was 4 days of uncontrolled inferno. The fire started in the early hours of Sunday, September 2nd. A spark, a little too much dry wood, and suddenly the bakery was ablaze. Now, in any well-organized city, you'd have a fire brigade, alarms, perhaps even a system of water pumps. London, however, was more of a bucket and prayer operation at this point. The alarm was raised, but the response was sluggish. After all, fires were fairly common. Most of them burned out after consuming a house or two. But this one had ambition. The summer had been unusually dry. The city was parched, its wooden buildings brittle as tinder. Add in a strong wind, and the fire leapt from house to house with the enthusiasm of rumor in a crowded tavern. By morning, the skyline glowed orange. By afternoon, entire streets were swallowed. And within days, London was unrecognizable. Now, the Great Fire is often remembered as one of the worst disasters in the city's history. And yes, in terms of property damage, it absolutely was. Over 13,000 houses gone. Nearly 90 churches destroyed. Businesses, homes, entire neighborhoods reduced to ash. But here's the strange, slightly comforting part. Very few people died. Officially, the number recorded was just 6. Historians today suspect the real figure was higher, but still, compared to the destruction, it was astonishingly low. And perhaps that's why the Great Fire has become such a soothing story to retell. It's destruction on a grand scale, yes, but it's also survival. The city burned, but the people endured. And when ashes cooled, London had the chance to reinvent itself, which, to be fair, it desperately needed. Of course, not everyone saw it that way at the time. Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist, left us one of the most vivid accounts. He described the fire with a mixture of horror and fascination, at one point burying his expensive Parmesan cheese in the garden to save it from the flames. Yes, Parmesan cheese. In times of crisis, people cling to what matters most. The fire raged for 4 days, until Thursday, September 6th, when it finally died down, partly because the wind dropped and partly because desperate fire breaks, the demolishing of houses to stop the spread, finally took effect. By then, London was a smoldering ruin. The iconic St. Paul's Cathedral, the pride of the city, had collapsed in flames, its stones cracked and shattered. And yet, from the ashes came renewal. Sir Christopher Wren, the architect, would later redesign St. Paul's into the grand dome we know today. The medieval maze of streets gave way. Eventually, to wider roads, sturdier houses, and fire regulations that, imagine this, suggested perhaps building fewer houses entirely out of wood. There's a rhythm to the Great Fire that makes it strangely comforting to think about. The quiet beginnings in a bakery, the unstoppable growth, like a living creature, the destruction, total but not deadly, and then the calm, the rebuilding, the resilience. It's almost like a cycle of nature, like a forest fire that clears away for new growth. And when told at night, in hushed tones, it feels less like a tragedy and more like a reassurance. Yes, things fall apart. Yes, the world burns now and then, sometimes literally. But life goes on. People adapt. Cities rise again. So, as you picture the flames licking to the narrow streets of old London, the glow lighting up the sky, the crackle of timbers collapsing, imagine also the silence that followed, the ash settling, the dawn after destruction. And perhaps that silence is the part that lingers, soft and calming, like the quiet after a storm. From London's firelit nights, we'll turn next to a different kind of journey. Not destruction this time, but exploration. A slow, meandering trek across rivers, plains, and mountains. The story of two men, some journals, and a vast landscape waiting to be mapped. The Lewis and Clark Expedition. Part 5. The Lewis and Clark Expedition, 1804 to 1806. And so, we leave behind the glowing embers of London, the sound of crackling timbers, and the faint smell of smoke clinging to the air. We turn now, thousands of miles away and over a century later, to the wide rivers and endless landscapes of North America. A quieter story, though no less ambitious. The tale of two men, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, and their long, winding journey into what at the time was called the unknown. Now, of course, it wasn't unknown. Not really. Indigenous peoples had lived there for centuries, navigating rivers, crossing mountains, naming every valley and plain. What it really was unknown to the United States government, which had just acquired a rather absurdly large piece of land through the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. President Thomas Jefferson, with his usual combination of curiosity and arrogance, decided that it might be useful to know what exactly he had bought. And so he appointed his secretary, Meriwether Lewis, to lead an expedition. Lewis, in turn, recruited his friend William Clark. Together they became the leaders of what history remembers as the Corps Discovery, a group of about 40 men who set out in May of 1804 to map the new territory, study its plants and animals, and establish relations with Native American tribes. The image of their journey is almost soothing in itself. Picture it. Wide rivers, stretching out like mirrors under the sky, canoes gliding quietly, oars dipping rhythmically into the water, the creak of leather, the slap of rope against wood, the occasional murmur of conversation, and all around them, forests, prairies, and a horizon that seemed to never end. Unlike the chaos of fire or the mystery of vanishing colonies, this story unfolds at a long walk. Day after day, mile after mile, the Corps Discovery pushed westward. They documented everything: new species of plants, unfamiliar animals, strange landscapes. Lewis had a keen scientific eye. Clark, a gift for drawing maps. Between them, they created a record of a continent that Europeans had barely begun to comprehend. And then, of course, there was Sacagawea, a Shoshone woman, married to a French-Canadian trapper, who joined the expedition as an interpreter and guide. She carried her infant son with her, which, as many historians have pointed out, was itself a form of diplomacy. A party traveling with a woman and child was far less threatening to the tribes they encountered than a group of armed men marching alone. Sacagawea became a bridge between cultures, helping Lewis and Clark navigate not only the land, but also the human relationships that were so essential to survival. There's something wonderfully meditative about their journey. They weren't racing against time. They weren't fighting battles every day. Instead, it was a steady rhythm of travel, observation, and adaptation. Yes, there were hardships, hunger, illness, the occasional near disaster, but there was also a sense of wonder. Every bend in the river revealed something new. Every sunrise over the plains felt like the beginning of possibility. Jefferson, of course, had scientific ambitions. He wanted catalogs of plants, descriptions of animals, reports of geology. And Lewis, ever the meticulous note-taker, delivered pages filled with careful observations, sometimes precise, sometimes wildly inaccurate, but always earnest. For example, Lewis described the prairie dog, an animal he had never seen before, in loving detail. He even tried to capture one alive to send back east, though the poor creature did not cooperate. The men of the expedition endured extremes. Sweltering summers on the plains, with mosquitoes buzzing incessantly, bone-chilling winters where the rivers froze solid and progress stalled. Yet even in hardship, there's a strangely comforting pattern. Set up camp, cook what food could be gathered, write in the journals, and wait for spring. By November 1805, after more than a year of travel, they reached the Pacific Ocean. Imagine the relief, the endless rolling waves, the cries of seabirds, the salt air after months of riverbanks and forests. They had crossed the continent. They built Fort Clatsop near present-day Astoria, Oregon, where they wintered before beginning the long journey home. The return trip, though quicker, still stretched over many months. But by September 1806, they were back in St. Louis, greeted as heroes, having mapped the path from the Mississippi River to Pacific and brought back an encyclopedia of knowledge. And here's the soothing part. Their story is less about conquest and more about curiosity. It's about moving steadily forward, step by step, through a world that was vast and beautiful. There are no great battles here, no fire catastrophes, no vanishing acts, just a long, steady rhythm of exploration. If you let your mind drift, you can almost hear it. The quiet splash of oars, the rustle of wind through tall grass, the scribble of pen on paper by lantern light. It's the kind of story that feels like a long exhale. And perhaps that's the perfect way to end our journey tonight. We began with Paul Revere, galloping through the night to rouse a sleepy countryside. We puzzled over the silence of Roanoke, where voices faded into mystery. We watched London burn and then rebuild itself from the ashes. And finally, we floated down the rivers with Lewis and Clark, where curiosity unfolded mile by mile. Each story different, each with its own rhythm, but all of them, in their own way, soothing when told in the quiet of the night. So, as you rest now, whether awake, half asleep, or already drifting into dreams, remember that history is not just dates and battles. It's stories, long, wandering human stories. And sometimes, the best way to experience them is not in a classroom, but in the stillness of the night, as you let the words carry you gently into sleep. Good night.